By any measure, it is the world's most powerful military alliance, a bloc of 31 countries united by a common defense clause which states that an attack on one is an attack on all. Yet the past few weeks have suggested that all is not well in the NATO club. That rather than standing united, alliance members are becoming increasingly riven by internal squabbles. The biggest of all, the argument over who is, and who isn't, hitting their spending targets. Formalized in 2014 and strengthened in 2023, NATO's guidelines dictate that all members should spend 2% of their GDP on defense. While not legally enforceable, a rift is nonetheless growing between those who hit this limit and those countries that fall way short of it. A rift that exploded into the open with Donald Trump's recent comments about not defending allies who don't reach the spending threshold. So, well, now seems like a good time to dive into the nitty-gritty of all of this, to figure out which countries are paying their way and which are the free riders. The answer's probably not exactly what you'd expect. Given its overwhelming prominence today, it can be weird to discover that NATO originally didn't have any spending guidelines at all. Founded in 1949 by 10 European countries plus the US and Canada to combat the growing threat of the Soviet Union, NATO spent its first quarter of a century not even bothering to track members' defense spending. It was only in 1974 that anyone in the alliance was like, hey guys, do you think we should be tracking how much people are paying for this NATO thing? But even then, the idea of a spending target was not even a gleam in the Secretary General's eye. In fact, it wouldn't be until long after the Cold War was over that the bloc finally decided to broach the idea of budgets. The year was 2002, and the location was the most legendary city on Earth, Prague. That November, heads of the alliance agreed to set a budgetary benchmark. Originally, CBC reports that the Bush White House was pushing for it to be mandatory, only to later drop the idea. It was from this fateful meeting that the concept of spending 2% of GDP emerged, but it wouldn't be until 2014 that the alliance tried to make it official. That's because 2014 is the year that everything changed for European security. In the east, Russia annexed Crimea and fomented war in Ukraine's Donbass region. In the south, near NATO member Turkey, a brutal caliphate arose from the ashes of Iraq and Syria. With the geopolitical temperature rising, the 28 then members all agreed to raise defense spending to 2% of GDP. To make sure things went smoothly, they were given a 10-year time frame to achieve this. Fast forward to 2024 to today, and not everyone has made it. Even as the threats from Russia and China grow, there are still member countries who are spending way below the threshold. Now, we'll get onto the naming and shaming later. For now, we want to quickly clear up a couple of things so we all understand exactly what is at stake here. The first is who exactly is a member of NATO. Although American media often refers to Europeans when talking about the alliance members on the continent, we should be clear that there are 5 EU states that are outside of NATO. While one of them, Sweden, is in the process of joining, Ireland, Austria, Malta, and Cyprus have no plans to enter the alliance. Additionally, there are 6 European members of NATO who aren't in the EU: the UK, Norway, Iceland, Montenegro, North Macedonia, and Albania. Finally, there are 3 countries in the NATO family who aren't European at all. One of them, the United States, is likely where you're watching this from based on our viewer statistics. After that, there's Canada and Turkey. Altogether, that adds up to 31 member states, or 32 when Sweden finally joins. 31 states treaty-bound to assist one another in the event of an attack, a provision that has only ever been activated once by the USA in the immediate aftermath of 9/11. It's at this point that we get on to the second thing we need to clear up. While NATO members are bound to defend one another, they are not treaty-bound to spend 2% of GDP on defense. Although it's a focus of debate right now, the 2% threshold is not some sort of legal duty. As defense analyst Ulrich Franke posted on X, it is simply not true that NATO members not reaching it are in any kind of breach of contract. Likewise, we need to be clear that this money doesn't go into some kind of NATO pot. As journalist Matthew Iglesias recently bemoaned, I wish reporting on this would indicate to people that there is no NATO funds that these countries are in arrears to. We're emphasizing this because mainstream reporting on the issue has, frankly, been fairly abysmal. As a result, a lot of people seem to incorrectly believe that 2% is some kind of fee that alliance members must pay, and that those who don't owe America money. The truth is not close to that. It's a figure alliance members are supposed to spend on their own militaries and R&D to ensure the whole collective defense thing works as a serious deterrent. That's not to let those countries that miss the target off the hook, though. As NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg said this February, Europeans and Canada have to spend more because we haven't seen fair burden sharing in the alliance. This is particularly important given what's happening with NATO's enemies. As it shifts to a war economy, Russia is now spending a full 6% of its GDP on defense, equivalent to about 40% of the overall state budget. That's the highest in modern history, and Moscow is not alone. While Beijing officially spends only a little over 1% of GDP on its armed forces, the real figure is thought to be significantly higher. All of which is why it's time for us to turn our attention to the 31 members of NATO and find out who is really pulling their weight and who is letting everybody down. One reason NATO heads like to talk about burden sharing is due to the wildly different size of their economies. Hence the 2% of GDP thing. It's a target any nation can aspire to. Yet this sometimes obscures massive differences in what each country actually contributes. Speaking to PolitiFact, Justin Logan of the Cato Institute recently pointed out that, quoting here, 2% of the German economy is more than double the entire Estonian economy. These sorts of differences are why you'll often hear people complaining that the US makes up nearly 70% of all NATO spending. It's not just that America spends an unusually high percentage of its GDP on defense, it's also that the American economy is just so much bigger than that of any other NATO member. Even among economies that aren't as crazy large, you see something similar happening. Logan likewise highlights how France and Turkey, which don't meet the 2% standard, have far more firepower than most of those who meet the standard. Of course, asking every NATO member to spend as much in raw dollars as France or Turkey, let alone America, would pretty quickly bankrupt all but the wealthiest. So spending a percentage is seen as fairer. But even with this caveat, there are still people who think the 2% thing is dumb. The Atlantic Council recently highlighted the example of Greece, quoting, whose ability to surpass the 2% threshold was tied to its absence of economic growth. Lacking a better metric, though, it's one the alliance has just decided to roll with. Although the question of who is hitting it can be contentious. Now, if you follow the news, you may have noticed different outlets giving different totals of NATO countries who reach 2%. US News and World, for example, says it's only 11 countries out of 31, a mere 35%. Politico, on the other hand, claims the true figure is 18, or over half. So what's this about? For the discrepancy, you can thank the existence of two different datasets, spending levels for 2023 and spending commitments for 2024. For most of the last decade, a member state's spending level one year was a pretty good indicator of what it would be the next. But since Russia's unprovoked attack on Ukraine, European economies have been boosting spending so quickly that the figures no longer necessarily track. For example, Turkey spent a mere 1.31% of GDP on defense last year, putting it fourth from the bottom in the NATO rankings. But spending plans for this year will catapult that total to beyond 4% of GDP, an eye-watering $40.5 billion American dollars. So to make things simple, we're going to split alliance members in this video into three categories. Those like the United States that regularly spend over 2%, those like Belgium that never do, and those like Turkey that were historical laggards but are due to cross the threshold in 2024. Now, with that out of the way, let's start by looking at the NATO country that spends the highest percent of its GDP on defense. A country that, you might be surprised to learn, is not called the United States. Rather, it's a proud nation known as Poland. Back in January 2023, we released a video called Is Poland Europe's Next Military Superpower? We chose the title because even back then, it was obvious that Warsaw was embarking on a defense spending spree that would catapult it ahead of all peer nations. A military splurge that was far more significant than Germany's better-known Zeitenwende. Well, over a year later, what can we say? It looks like we were right. In 2023, NATO's second highest military spender, the USA, spent 3.49% of its GDP on defense. Poland, by contrast, spent 3.9%. 2024 will likely see that figure go even higher. Like Turkey, Poland is expected to cross the 4% threshold this year, an increase that will result in serious firepower. Already, Warsaw has 100 HIMARS rocket launchers in the pipeline and over 1,000 heavy tanks. With spending showing no signs of ramping down, security consultant Pierre de Jong recently told Foreign Policy that Poland will clearly become Europe's largest conventional army. The reasons for this armament are pretty damn obvious. The oldest generation of Poles can still remember when the Red Army joined the Nazis to cleave their nation in two. Middle-aged people still remember the communist domination of their country from 1945 to 1989, and the youngest simply need to look across the border to Ukraine to see how history might repeat itself. And it is here that we get to one of the paradoxes of Trump's recent remarks. When the former, and perhaps future, president said of alliance members who don't pay their dues, "I would encourage Russia to do whatever the hell they want to them," he made it seem like there are NATO countries close to Moscow that don't hit the 2% target. In truth, practically all nations that share a border with Russia or Belarus pay significantly over 2%. The sole exception to this rule is Norway, which shares a short land border with Russia in its extreme north and spent 1.67% of GDP on defense last year. Estonia, Latvia, Finland, Lithuania, and Poland all pay their way. As Politico put it, there's a clear trend in NATO members' defense budgets. The closer to Russia, the higher the spending. This is especially true among the former Baltic states. Former members of the Soviet Union, they now lead the way in defense budgets. Tiny Estonia, for example, is the fourth largest NATO spend after Poland, the US, and Greece, spending 2.73% of GDP in 2023, a number that's due to rise to 3.2% in 2024. Lithuania, too, is trying to pull its weight. As the Minister of Foreign Affairs recently wrote on X, Lithuania's defense budget has grown 302% since 2014. That's a bigger increase than any other NATO member. An increase that has now taken it to over 2.5% of GDP. Among those member states that don't border Russia or Belarus, but do border the war zone in Ukraine, the numbers are slightly lower, but still high above the 2% threshold. Romania and Hungary both spend above 2.4%, while Slovakia spends more or less exactly 2%. Not the proximity to the Russia-Ukraine war is the only deciding factor. Aside from the United States, there are two other nations far from the action that have historically paid their dues: the UK and Greece. The third highest spender as a percentage of GDP, Greece has its own problems to worry about, the biggest of which is fellow NATO member Turkey, a neighbour with whom it's fought several wars and has an active dispute with over Cyprus. High defence spending, therefore, makes as much sense for Athens as it does for Warsaw. The United Kingdom, on the other hand, is a special case, a one-time military superpower that still likes to think of itself as a Tier 1 power, sort of like a smaller USA. Whether that's really the case is pretty debatable, but what's not up for debate is Britain's defence spending. At 2.3% of GDP, that translates, in raw money, to the second highest military spend in NATO. Globally, only 5 capitals spend more on defence in actual dollars than London. Finally, we should give a shout out to Europe in general. As a whole, the continent's NATO members spend exactly 2% of their collective GDP on defense. As Politico points out, that's a huge jump from the collective 1.49% that Europe spent in 2014. But of course, NATO isn't only a group endeavor. Just as there are individual capitals that are shouldering the military burden, there are others that have been slacking off for decades. Among the people who get het up about Europe not paying enough for its own defense, there's one nation in particular that acts as the continental bogeyman. Germany has spent the decades after the Cold War playing the part of the ungrateful roomie who refuses to pay their fair share of the rent and then makes fun of you for working so hard while they blow their own money on endless bratwurst and quality healthcare. Even after Chancellor Olaf Scholz announced a €100 billion special fund for military modernization in the wake of Russia's invasion, defense spending remained weak. 2023 figures show Berlin hit a mere 1.57% of GDP. For those sympathetic to Trump's comments, this is the textbook case of a nation not pulling its weight. After recently overtaking Japan, Germany is now the world's third largest economy. If any capital could afford to spend more, it's surely Berlin. All of which is why the recent news was so welcome. Shortly after Trump made his comments, German Defense Minister Boris Pistorius announced that Germany was allocating the equivalent of $76.8 billion for defense spending in 2024. In Pistorius' words, this means Berlin, quote, will reach the agreed 2% target this year. The announcement on February the 15th caps a 2-year transformation of Germany's relationship with its military. From a mostly pacifist state haunted by its Nazi past, recent surveys by PwC show nearly 70% of Germans now support more defense spending. On Ukraine too, Germany has gone from being an unenthusiastic supporter to the third largest overall contributor after the United States and European Union. The day we were writing this episode, for example, Scholz announced a new support package for Ukraine worth $1.22 billion. This is what we mean when we say mainstream reporting on this issue has been abysmal. Look at most American media, and Germany is still portrayed as it was in 2022, a dithering, low-spending laggard rather than the military behemoth that it is trying to become. Of course, we shouldn't paint an overly rosy picture, though. The Commissioner for Germany's Armed Forces, Eva Hogel, has said that the special €100 billion fund needs to triple in size to bring Berlin's military up to scratch after decades of neglect. Still, 2024 appears to be the year that Germany at last begins to take up its mantle as a defense leader in Europe. Nor is it the only NATO laggard at last turning the ship around. There's also France. Although France gets a bad rep for not paying its dues in some media, the reality is that Paris always has spent a significant amount on defense. At 1.9% of GDP, it was the highest spending country in 2023 to not breach the 2% threshold. As we mentioned earlier, it's also one of Europe's only true military powers. The sole EU country with nuclear weapons, France also projects its strength around the world like no other NATO power except the United States. And to be fair to Paris, it's also in the process of implementing a plan that was supposed to haul it across the 2% limit by 2025. And we say was there because France actually wound up hitting the target early. With a 2024 budget of €47.2 billion, Armed Forces Minister Sébastien Lecornu was able to announce recently that Paris would cross the 2% threshold this year. And it's not stopping there. Under the 7-year military planning law, spending is due to rise to almost €70 billion in the coming years. As with Germany, though, this silver lining comes with a great dark cloud. After spending close to 3% of GDP on defense during the Cold War, Paris hugely scaled back after the financial crisis. Foreign Policy reports that by 2015, quote, the country was left with 1/3 of the troops, 1/4 of the artillery pieces, and 1/10 of the tanks. Even with accelerated spending now, it will take time to make up for such a gutting of the armed forces. But hey, at least things are moving in the right direction. And that's a statement that is true about a surprising number of NATO countries. As we mentioned earlier, Turkey is another nation that's ramping up defense spending in 2024, and Ankara's case to an absolutely insane degree. While few other countries are aiming to go quite so fast, there are now 7 former NATO laggards who are due to finally cross 2% this year. To take just one example close to me, the Czech Republic signed a law last summer committing the country to raise defense spending from 1.5% of GDP to 2% starting this year. In this, it will be joined by other countries like Bulgaria and Albania. Overall, 18 NATO members will hit the target in 2024, up from 11 last year. Even some who don't quite make it are not going to be far behind. Norway recently committed to the 2% target, and while Oslo won't hit it in 2024, it should do so in 2025 or 2026. In short, NATO countries as a whole are rising out of their slumber, with even many of the laggards now racing to get their acts together. But not all of them, because it's time now for our final section, likely the one that you've been waiting for all this time, the section where we name and shame the countries that even today are resolutely refusing to give up their free riding. Now, if you look at any graph of NATO members' spending, you might notice something odd. Although there are 31 members, most datasets rank just 30 nations by spending. And it's not because newest member Finland hasn't had time to submit any figures. Rather, it's because founding member Iceland is deliberately excluded. The reason? As a nation without any armed forces, Iceland effectively doesn't spend anything on defense. As a result, Reykjavik is normally considered a special case when discussing NATO, one that shouldn't really be held to the 2% standard. And nor is it the only one. Although it lies at the bottom of every ranking, spending at just 0.72% of GDP, Luxembourg is widely agreed to be another special case. A country of just 640,000, of whom about 47% are foreigners with residency, and an army comprising just 900 personnel. On top of its diminutive size, Luxembourg's GDP per capita is also so crazy high that it already spends one of the highest amounts per person on defense, $764 for every resident living in the country. Given all this, there are very few willing to class either Iceland or Luxembourg as true free riders. They're more micronations with their own weird dynamics that can't be judged by normal standards. No, if we want to locate the true piss takers, we need to look a little further up the rankings, to the rich, normal-sized nations that nonetheless utterly rely on their neighbors for protection. In NATO circles, the most infamous of all is Belgium. At 1.13% of GDP, it spends the lowest amount of any nation not called Luxembourg or Iceland. This is particularly galling since in 2014, Prime Minister De Rupo promised to hit the 2% target by 2024. Well, now it is 2024, and Prime Minister De Croo is instead promising to hit it by 2035, at which point the new PM will presumably be like, got you, 2049. Yeah, maybe. sometime tomorrow. Of course, the Belgian position is presumably that they are a long way from Russia and have France to rely on for protection. Still, their commitment to low defense spending is so total that military analyst blog Oryx once declared, Belgium is often considered the black sheep of NATO. Another rich country, a long way from Russia that only spends painfully little, is Spain. At 1.26%, it's only a little worse than another large European economy, Italy. And although Rome pledged to catch up with France and Britain, Defense Minister Guido Crosetto recently admitted that the country would struggle to hit the 2% target even by 2028. However, we don't want to just dunk on European nations in this section, because there's another country, an entire ocean away, that spends so little on defense. The Economist recently characterized its position as increasingly embarrassing. And we're of course talking about Canada. The reason why Ottawa doesn't need to splurge on defense is obvious. There is literally no universe in which Russia or China bombs Canada and Big Brother America doesn't come rushing to help. Even if the US pulls out of NATO, flips Europe the bird, and declares itself isolationist forever, it's impossible to imagine Washington not having Ottawa's back. As a result, Canada today spends a measly 1.38% of GDP on defense, a figure so low, if you discount Luxembourg, it's among the bottom fifth in NATO. And unlike former laggards, Germany and Turkey, Canada has no plans to significantly increase that spending. According to The Economist, leaked Pentagon intelligence documents confirmed that Mr. Trudeau had told NATO allies not only that Canada would not reach the 2% commitment in 2023, but that it never would. Again, that makes financial sense from Canada's perspective. In the same way that Belgium can slack off because France will always defend it, Ottawa is content to rely on America. But just because something is good financial sense doesn't mean it's not dumb in other ways. The Economist points out that global warming is opening up Arctic shipping routes that are contested by Russia and China, and that are uncomfortably close to Canada's far north. While the battlegrounds right now are Eastern Europe and Taiwan, it may not be long before a greater geopolitical competition is taking place in the Arctic, a competition that Canada would be dragged into whether Ottawa likes it or not. Given such an uncertain future, does it really make sense for Canada to be so utterly reliant on American largesse? At the end of all that then, we've hopefully demonstrated that the politics around the 2% rule are more complicated than you may have realized, and that stereotypes about certain countries not paying their way Germany are fast becoming outdated, unreflective of the new era of uncertainty most NATO members are living through. That being said, it's hopefully also clear that NATO's collective deterrence can only work if enough allies are willing to put the money in. To build militaries so robust, even the madman in the Kremlin will think twice about trying to move his borders westward. Because, scary as it is to say, NATO may not always be able to rely on America. As much as we pray that that's not the case, the only surefire way to hedge against that outcome is to do what 18 members are already doing and start building formidable deterrence. Deterrence that hopefully will ensure a costly NATO war with Russia never comes.